Chapter 47. One of the founders of California, a woman missionary to the Society Islands, her life among the natives, the only Mormon woman sent on mission without her husband, a Mormon woman in Washington, a sister from the East Indies, a sister from Texas. The Mormons were not only the founders of Utah, but they were also the first American immigrants to California. Fremont and his volunteers, and the American Navy, had, it is true, effected the coup de main of taking possession of California, and the American flag was hoisted in the Bay of San Francisco at the very moment of the arrival of the ship Brooklyn with its company of Mormon emigrants, but to that company belongs the honor of first settlers. The wife of Colonel Jackson thus narrates, "In the month of February, 1846, I left home and friends and sailed in the ship Brooklyn for California. Before starting, I visited my parents in New Hampshire. I told them of my determination to follow God's people, who had already been notified to leave the United States, that our destination was the Pacific coast, and that we should take materials to plant a colony. When the hour came for parting, my father could not speak, and my mother cried out in despair, 'When shall we see you again, my child?' 'When there is a railroad across the continent,' I answered. Selling all my household goods, I took my child in my arms and went on board ship. Of all the memories of my life, not one is so bitter as that dreary 6 months' voyage in an emigrant ship around the Horn. When we entered the harbor of San Francisco, an officer came on board and said, 'Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to inform you that you are in the United States.' 3 cheers from all on board answered the announcement. Unlike the California of today, we found the country barren and dreary, but we trusted in God, and He heard our prayers, and when I soaked the moldy shipbread, purchased from the whale ships lying in the harbor, and fried it in the tallow taken from the raw hides lying on the beach, God made it sweet to me and to my child, for on this food I weaned her. It made me think of Hagar and her babe, and of the God who watched over her." Passing over the hardships endured by these emigrants, which were greatly augmented by the fact that war was then raging between the United States and the Spanish residents of California, we deem it proper to here incorporate, as matter of history, some statements of Mrs. Jackson made to the California journals concerning the early days of San Francisco. She says, "From many statements made by persons who have lately adopted California as their home, I am led to believe it is the general impression that no American civilized beings inhabited this region prior to the discovery of gold, and that the news of this discovery reaching home brought the first adventurers. As yet I have nowhere seen recorded the fact that in July 1846, the ship Brooklyn landed on the shore of San Francisco Bay 250 passengers, among whom were upwards of 70 females, it being the first emigration to this place via Cape Horn. In October previous, a company had arrived overland, most of whom had been detained at Sacramento Fort, being forbidden by the governor to proceed further. Upon arriving in Yerba Buena in '46, we found 2 of these families, some half-dozen American gentlemen, 3 or 4 old Californians with their families, the officers and Marines of the sloop of war Portsmouth, and about 100 Indians, occupying the place now called San Francisco. The ship Brooklyn left us on the rocks at the foot of what is now Broadway. From this point we directed our steps to the old adobe on, now, DuPont Street. It was the first to shelter us from the chilling winds. A little further on, toward Jackson Street, stood the adobe of old English Jack, who kept a sort of depot for the milk woman, who came in daily, with a dozen bottles of milk hung to an old horse, and which they retailed at a real 12½ cents per bottle. At this time, where now are Jackson and Stockton Streets, were the outer boundaries of the town. Back of the home of English Jack stood a cottage built by an American who escaped from a whale ship and married a Californian woman. Attached to this house was a windmill and a shop. In this house I lived during the winter of '46, and the principal room was used by Dr. Poet of the Navy as a hospital. Here were brought the few who were saved of the unfortunate Donner Party, whose sad fate will never be forgotten. One of the Donner children, a girl of 9 years, related to me that her father was the first of that party to fall a victim to the cold and hunger. Her mother then came on with the children, till the babe grew sick and she was unable to carry it further. She told the children to go on with the company, and if the babe died, or she got stronger, she would come to them, but they saw her no more. After this, 2 of her little brothers died, and she told me, with tears running down her face, that she saw them cooked and had to eat them, but added, as though fearful of having committed a crime, "I could not help it. I had eaten nothing for days, and I was afraid to die." The poor child's feet were so badly frozen that her toes had dropped off. Very dramatic and picturesque have often been the situations of the Mormon sisters. Here is the story of one of them, among the natives of the Society Islands. She says, "I am the wife of the late Elder Addison Pratt, who was the first missionary to the Society Islands, he having been set apart by the prophet for this mission in 1843. My husband went on his mission, but I, with my children, was left to journey afterwards with the body of the church to the Rocky Mountains. We reached the valley in the fall of 1848 and had been there but a week when Elder Pratt arrived, coming by the northern route with soldiers from the Mexican War. He had been absent 5 years and 4 months. Only one of his children recognized him, which affected him deeply. 1 year passed away in comparative comfort and pleasure, when again Mr. Pratt was called to go and leave his family, and again I was left to my own resources. However, 6 months afterwards several elders were called to join Elder Pratt in the Pacific Isles, and myself and family were permitted to accompany them. Making the journey by ox team to San Francisco on the 15th of September, 1850, we embarked for Tahiti. Sailing to the southwest of that island 360 miles, we made the island of Tupuai, where Mr. Pratt had formerly labored, and where we expected to find him, but to our chagrin found that he was a prisoner under the French governor at Tahiti. After counseling upon the matter, we decided to land on Tupuai and petition the governor of Tahiti for Mr. Pratt's release, which we did, aided by the native king, who promised to be responsible for Mr. Pratt's conduct. The petition was granted by the governor, and in due course Mr. Pratt joined us at Tupuai. It was a day of great rejoicing among the natives when he arrived, they all being much attached to him, and it was also a great day for our children. A volume might be written in attempting to describe the beauties of nature on that little speck in the midst of the great ocean, but I must hasten to speak of the people. Simple and uncultivated as the natives are, they are nevertheless a most lovable and interesting race. Their piety is deep and sincere, and their faith unbounded. Within a year, I became a complete master of their language, and addressed them publicly in the Firbereare prayer house frequently. My daily employment was teaching in the various departments of domestic industry, such as needlework, knitting, etc., and my pupils, old and young, were both industrious and apartment. Elder Addison Pratt died in 1872, but his respected missionary wife is living in Utah today, resting from her labors and waiting for the reward of the faithful. A somewhat similar experience to the above is that of Sister Mildred E. Randall, who went with her husband, at a later date, to labor in the Sandwich Islands. Her first mission lasted about 18 months, and her second 3 years. On her third mission to the islands, she was called to go without her husband, thus making her to be the only woman in the history of the Church who has been called to go on foreign mission independently of her husband. In this connection will also suitably appear Sister Elizabeth Drake Davis, who served her people well while in the Treasury Department at Washington. She was born in the town of Axminster, Devonshire, England, and was an only child. Having lost her father when she was but 10 years of age, and not being particularly attached to her mother, her life became markedly lonely and desolate. In her extremity, she sought the Lord in prayer, when a remarkable vision was shown her, which was repeated at 2 subsequent times, making a permanent impression on her life, and, in connection with other similar experiences, leading her to connect herself with the Church of Latter-day Saints. After being widowed in her native land, she crossed the Atlantic and resided for 2 years in Philadelphia. In May 1859, with a company of Philadelphian saints, she gathered to Florence for the purpose of going thence to Utah. An incident there occurred that will be of interest to the reader. She says, "We reached Florence late one evening. It was quite dark and raining. We were helped from the wagons and put in one of the vacant houses, myself, my two little daughters, and Sister Sarah White. Early next morning, we were aroused by someone knocking at the door. On opening it, we found a little girl with a cup of milk in her hand. She asked if there was a little woman there with two little children. "Yes," said Sister White, "come in." She entered, saying to me, "If you please, my ma wants to see you. She has sent this milk to your little girls." Her mother's name was strange to me, but I went, thinking to find someone that I had known. She met me at the door with both hands extended in welcome. "Good morning, Sister Elizabeth," said she. I told her she had the advantage of me, as I did not remember ever seeing her before. "No," said she, "and I never saw you before. I am Hiram Smith's daughter, Lavina Walker. My father appeared to me 3 times last night and told me that you were the child of God, that you was without money, provisions, or friends, and that I must help you." It is needless to add that this excellent lady and myself were ever thereafter firm friends, until her death, which occurred in 1876. I will add that previous to her last illness I had not seen her in 13 years, that one night her father appeared to me, and making himself known, said his daughter was in sore need. I found the message was too true. Yet it will ever be a source of gratitude to think I was at last able to return her generous kindness to me when we were strangers. Mrs. Davis's husband, she having married a second time, enlisted in the United States Army in March 1863. Shortly thereafter, she received an appointment as clerk in the Treasury Department at Washington, which position she held until November 1869, when she resigned in order to prosecute unhampered, a design which she had formed to memorialize Congress against the Cullum Bill. In this laudable endeavor she was singularly successful, and it is proper to add that by dint of pure pluck, as against extremely discouraging circumstances, she secured the cooperation of General Butler and Mr. Sumner, the great senator from Massachusetts. It is entirely just to say that her efforts were largely instrumental in modifying the course of Congress upon the Mormon question at that time. Sister Davis is at present one of the active women of Utah and will doubtless figure prominently in the future movements of the sisterhood. The story of Sister Hannah Booth is best told by herself. She says, "I was born in Chumar, India. My father was a native of Portugal and my mother was from Manila. My husband was an officer in the English Army in India, as were also my father and grandfather. We lived in affluent circumstances, keeping 9 servants, a carriage, etc., and I gave my attention to the profession of obstetrics. When the gospel was introduced into India, my son Charles, who was civil engineer in the army, met the elders traveling by sea and was converted. He brought to me the gospel, which I embraced with joy, and from that time was eager to leave possessions, friends, children, and country to unite with this people. My son George, a surgeon in the army, remained behind, although he had embraced the gospel. My sister, a widow, and my son Charles and his wife, daughter of Lieutenant Kent, son of Sir Robert Kent, of England, and their infant daughter, came with me. Reaching San Francisco, we proceeded thence to San Bernardino, arriving there in 1855. Having, in India, had no occasion to perform housework, we found ourselves greatly distressed in our new home by our lack of such needful knowledge. We bought a stove, and I tried first to make a fire. I made the fire in the first place that opened, the oven, and was greatly perplexed by its smoking and not drawing. We were too mortified to let our ignorance be known, and our bread was so badly made, and all our cooking so wretchedly done, that we often ate fruit and milk rather than the food we had just prepared. We also bought a cow, and not knowing how to milk her, had great trouble. 4 of us surrounded her. My son tied her head to the fence, her legs to a post, her tail to another, and while he stood by to protect me, my sister and daughter-in-law to suggest and advise, I proceeded to milk on the wrong side, as I afterwards learned. After a while, however, some good sisters kindly taught us how to work. Just as we had become settled in our own new house, the saints prepared to leave San Bernardino in the winter of '56-7. We sold our home at great sacrifice and, 6 of us in one wagon, with 2 yoke of Spanish oxen, started for Utah. On the desert, our oxen grew weak and our supplies began to give out. We, who at home in India had servants at every turn, now had to walk many weary miles through desert sands and in climbing mountains. My sister and I would, in the morning, bind our cashmere scarfs around our waists, take each a staff, and with a small piece of bread each, we would walk ahead of the train. At noon we would rest, ask a blessing upon the bread, and go on. Weary, footsore, and hungry, we never regretted leaving our luxurious homes, nor longed to return. We were thankful for the knowledge that had led us away, and trusted God to sustain us in our trials and lead us to a resting place among the saints. After our journey ended, we began anew to build a home. I am, after 20 years among this people, willing to finish my days with them, whatever their lot and trials may be, and I pray God for His Holy Spirit to continue with me to the end. Nor should we omit to mention Mrs. Wilmarth East, now in her 64th year, who was converted to Mormonism while residing with her father's family in Texas in 1853. Her ancestors fought in the Revolutionary War, and her father, Nathaniel H. Greer, was a member of the legislature of Georgia and also a member of the legislature of Texas after his removal to that state. She has long resided in Utah, is a living witness of many miracles of healing, and has often manifested in her own person the remarkable gifts of this dispensation. She may be accounted one of the most enthusiastic and steadfast of the saints.